Hello and welcome. What do you do when you know that orders given to you by higher ranking officers are wrong and will lead to men dying? This was the dilemma faced by Australian fighter pilot Squadron leader John F. Jackson, DFC. Let me paint the scene. These were the desperate days at the outbreak of the Pacific War. Between the fall of Singapore and the Battle of the Coral Sea, the fate of Australia was in the hands of men and women based in northern Australia and New Guinea. Japan was driving south and threatening supply of America to Australia. Prime Minister John Curtin was told that we had no frontline fighter squadrons operating from our own soil. We had offered about half of our 246 aircraft to be used in Europe. Not surprising, considering that the RAAF's commander was a British officer. Curtin bombarded Churchill and Roosevelt with demands for fighter aircraft. Finally, Kittyhawks arrived in February 1942, not because Roosevelt had sent them here, but because 75 Kittyhawks had been shipped to Java. That island fell before the convoy could land, so they were diverted to Sydney. Lucky us. 75 Squadron was formed to fly them north to Townsville, and such was the inexperience of the pilots on these aircraft that 3 crashed during the trip. It would need an exceptional commander to lead 75. By good fortune, one of Australia's best airmen was home on leave from his squadron in the Western Desert. This was John Jackson. At 34 years of age, he was the oldest fighter pilot in the RAAF. John arranged for his younger brother Les to join this new Kittyhawk squadron. It would be John that would lead 24 Australians against the experienced Japanese pilots. 75 Squadron was given 1 week to train and transfer to Port Moresby. What was waiting for them were the Japanese Mitsubishi Zeros, whose pilots had decimated our Wirraways in Rabaul and attacked Darwin and Broome. The Zero was half the weight of the Kittyhawk and was very manoeuvrable. It could climb faster and higher, but couldn't match the Kittyhawk in a dive. John Jackson said, "Do not get into a dogfight with the Zero. Attack from above in a dive." Japanese ace Saburo Sukai.
We had totally destroyed the American and the Dutch air forces within the region. There was nobody. Then Singapore fell as well, so there were no more enemies. That's why we were told to attack New Guinea. We expected some retaliation from the American and the Australian air forces. From the very beginning, our aim was to take over Port Moresby. Our immediate strategy was to establish total control of the skies over Moresby. Of course, the Australian and American forces wanted that control too. Japan had this huge plan. If Port Moresby was easy to take, we were to press on to Townsville in Australia.
First victory went to Wilbur Wackett and Barry Cox in their P-40 Kittyhawks, who shot down a Japanese bomber over Port Moresby. For the first time, the Japanese were now on the defensive. On April the 7th, John Jackson was flying reconnaissance when he was jumped by 3 Zeros and shot down into the sea. In 2 weeks, he managed to drag himself over mountains back to base. Just 3 days after John's return, the squadron was criticised by 2 RAAF wing commanders who told Jackson that his hit and dive tactics, which had saved the lives of so many Australian pilots, were cowardly. The Kittyhawk pilots should engage the enemy in dogfighting. John had no option but to follow this stupid command.
The Australians found that we Japanese and our Zeros were good at dogfights. The pilots must have decided that they won't be caught the second time with the same tactics. They thought, aha, we have a better advantage when we dive in. So, in their next attack, they came from a high altitude, diving right in. We lost a lot of planes that way because they used that tactic.
The next morning, 8 Japanese bombers and 14 fighters were spotted. 75 Squadron was now down to 5 Kittyhawks. The new tactics proved disastrous. John Jackson was last seen in a dogfight before being shot down.
Went in on the bombers and I was on my maximum climb and maximum, almost at a dead stop with everything on, pointing at the sky, and when I fired the guns. When I fired the guns, all hell broke loose and the aeroplane went into a spin, but I had seen some holes in the fuselage as I fired. I looked back when I got out of that through a break in the clouds and could see in the distance a fight was going on, and then heard John with all the epithets as usual, and knew that he was having a hell of a good fight of it. He was shouting in epithets that don't bear repeating about why he couldn't get into this fella and why he couldn't do that, and I've got no doubt that others were on him too at the time.
That you heard his last words, it would seem.
Yes, yes, as it turns out.
John's brother Les now took over the squadron. Les was a brilliant pilot, but in all other respects he was nothing like his older brother. Fond of a drink, flamboyant, wild. Les slouched about in a cowboy hat and wearing a .38 revolver. Not quite the Air Force officer, but within an hour of his appointment, Les Jackson had to face the fearful news that the Japanese invasion fleet was steaming towards Port Moresby. It was the 5th of May and the squadron was down to the last 3 serviceable Kittyhawks. A daring Zero attack damaged 2 planes, leaving Les alone to fly in search of the fleet in what would be a suicide mission. Fortunately for him, the fleet couldn't be found. This Japanese fleet was to engage the Allies in what would become known as the Battle of the Coral Sea. At the end of this epic defence of Port Moresby, 75 Squadron had lost half its pilots and was down to its last plane. But it had destroyed 4 times as many enemy aircraft, put heart into the ground troops, a heart they were soon to show at Kokoda, and to delay the invasion just long enough for the American fleet to turn the tide in the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway. What is more, they created a legend that is still spoken of today. Despite their losses, 12 pilots and 30 planes in those first 44 days, the squadron rested and reformed. Now, bolstered by Australian Spitfire veterans from Britain and led by Les Jackson, 75 Squadron returned to New Guinea and played a decisive role in the Allied victory at Milne Bay later in 1942. From there they pressed on to the Solomons and remained at the forefront until the last of the Japanese were driven from the South Pacific. Thank you for watching. Please comment, like and subscribe.